The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of Harmony Heights Conservatory, casting golden streaks across the polished oak floors of the grand auditorium. At the heart of the room stood a Fazioli grand piano, its sleek black curves gleaming like a polished gem, a custom-made masterpiece that was the pride of the institution. It belonged to Savannah Whitmore, the 17-year-old prodigy whose name was whispered with reverence in these halls. Daughter of a Silicon Valley tycoon, Savannah was as brilliant as she was beautiful, her fingers coaxing flawless concertos from the instrument with an ease that bordered on divine. But the piano was more than an instrument to her. It was an extension of her soul, fiercely guarded. No one dared touch it. Not the students, not the faculty, and certainly not the janitor. Samuel Hayes, a wiry man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and calloused hands, pushed his cleaning cart through the empty auditorium. His faded blue uniform hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes, deep-set and kind, carried the weight of years, unspoken. He'd worked at the conservatory for nearly a decade, sweeping floors, wiping down benches, and fading into the background of a world that belonged to the young and the gifted. Harmony Heights, nestled in the affluent suburbs of Northern California, was a place where dreams were polished to perfection, where the children of the elite honed their talents under chandeliers and stained glass. Samuel was invisible here, just another part of the machinery that kept the place pristine. But this morning something stirred in him. The auditorium was silent, save for the soft hum of his cart's wheels. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood, and the light streaming through the windows seemed to dance on the piano's keys, beckoning. Samuel paused, his mop resting against the cart. He glanced around. No one was there. The students wouldn't arrive for hours, and the faculty were tucked away in their offices. His gaze settled on the piano, its surface so flawless it seemed to hum with possibility. He'd always loved music, though he hadn't played in years, not since the days when life was kinder, before the bills piled up, before his wife's illness took her, before the world seemed to forget his name. He approached the piano slowly, reverently, as if it were a sacred relic. His heart thudded in, his chest a mix of guilt and longing. He shouldn't touch it. He knew that. But the keys gleamed like an invitation, and something in the quiet of the morning air urged him forward. He sat on the bench, the wood creaking faintly under his weight. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly, then descended. The first notes were soft, tentative, a low, bluesy melody that seemed to rise from some hidden corner of his soul. It was jazz, raw and unfiltered, full of ache and memory. For a moment, the auditorium was no longer a sterile hall, but a smoky club from decades past, where Samuel had once poured his heart into every chord. The music swelled, a slow, mournful improvisation that spoke of loss and love, of dreams buried under the weight of survival. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the notes carry him back to a time when he was more than a janitor, when he was a young man with a guitar slung over his shoulder, playing gigs in Oakland dive bars, dreaming of a life on stage. The melody was his story, grief for his wife, pride for the daughter he'd raised alone, and a quiet resilience that refused to let the world break him entirely. Then the door swung open. Savannah Whitmore stood in the doorway, flanked by two friends, their designer bags slung over their shoulders and iced coffees in hand. Her auburn hair caught the light, and her sharp green eyes narrowed as they landed on Samuel. The laughter that had been bubbling between the trio stopped abruptly. "Is he playing my piano?" Savannah's voice was cold, slicing through the air like a blade. Her friends snickered. One, a tall boy with a smug grin, muttered, "Guess he thought he was auditioning for America's Got Talent." Samuel leapt to his feet, his face flushing with shame. I'm sorry," he stammered, his hands raised as if to ward off her anger. I meant no harm." Savannah stepped closer, folding her arms. Her presence filled the room, commanding and unyielding. "You don't get to touch this piano," she snapped. "It's worth more than your life. Go back to your mops, old man." The laughter from her friends cut deeper than her words. Samuel lowered his eyes, nodding silently. He shuffled back to his cart, his shoulders hunched, and pushed it toward the door. The auditorium felt colder now, the light dimmer. He was invisible again, just as he was supposed to be. But Savannah lingered behind as her friends moved on, still chuckling. Her gaze drifted to the piano, and for a moment, her expression softened. She couldn't explain it, but something in Samuel's music had stirred her, a fleeting, unfamiliar feeling that made her chest ache. She shook her head, dismissing it, and followed her friends out. That evening, the auditorium was transformed. Velvet seats were filled with parents in tailored suits and glittering jewelry, faculty in crisp blazers, and donors whose names adorned the conservatory's walls. It was the monthly showcase night, an invitation-only event where the students of Harmony Heights performed for the elite. The air buzzed with anticipation, and at the center of it all was Savannah Whitmore, the headliner, as always. Her name alone drew crowds, her performances a guarantee of technical perfection. Backstage, Samuel worked in the shadows, wiping down a dusty stool, his movements mechanical. He'd pushed the morning's humiliation from his mind. He knew his place: clean, stay quiet, stay unseen. The music he'd played that morning was a lapse, a moment of weakness he couldn't afford to repeat. He focused on the task at hand, the familiar rhythm of his work grounding him. Then he heard it. "Mr. Hayes, would you join me on stage?" Words cut through the hum of the crowd, and Samuel froze. He thought he'd misheard, but when he peeked around the curtain, there she was, Savannah, standing under the spotlight, a microphone in her hand. Her voice was steady, unshaken by the murmurs rippling through the audience. "Earlier today, I overheard Mr. Hayes playing," she said. "What I heard was real, honest, and I think all of you should hear it too." The headmistress, a stern woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, stood from her seat, her expression a mix of confusion and disapproval. "Savannah, this is highly irregular." "I know," Savannah interrupted, her voice firm, "but music isn't just about perfection. It's about soul, and you need to hear his." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with skepticism. A few parents chuckled, expecting a stunt. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Samuel, his heart pounding, stepped forward. His janitor's uniform looked out of place under the golden lights, the faded blue fabric a stark contrast to the polished elegance around him. He crossed the stage slowly, his steps hesitant, as if the floor might give way beneath him. He didn't speak. He didn't bow. He simply sat at the piano. For a moment he stared at the keys, his hands trembling. The weight of the room pressed against him, hundreds of eyes, judging, waiting. He took a deep breath and his fingers found their place. The first notes were soft, uncertain, like a man stepping onto thin ice. But as he played, the music grew, a slow, haunting jazz improvisation that seemed to pull the air from the room. It was raw, unpolished, full of sorrow and love, of a life lost and a passion reborn. Each note carried the weight of his years, the nights spent caring for his dying wife, the sacrifices made for his daughter, the quiet dignity of a man who kept going when the world told him to stop. The auditorium fell silent. Savannah's father, a man who spent most performances checking his watch, sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Samuel. The headmistress lowered herself back into her seat. Even the donors, accustomed to flawless sonatas and technical virtuosity, leaned forward, breathless. This wasn't music from a score. It was music from a life. When Samuel finished, he didn't wait for applause. He stood, his head bowed, and began to walk off the stage. But the sound came, a few claps at first, then a wave, then a roar. The entire hall rose to their feet, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. Samuel turned, stunned. He hadn't expected this, not in a million years. The headmistress approached, her hands trembling. "Mr. Hayes, that was extraordinary. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Samuel smiled softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Would you have listened if I did?" Savannah stepped forward, her expression softer than it had been that morning. "I almost didn't," she admitted, "but I'm glad I did." In the days that followed, the conservatory buzzed with a new kind of energy. A student had secretly recorded Samuel's performance, and the video spread like wildfire. Janitor jazz trended on social media, shared by musicians across the country. Even Juilliard reposted it, calling it the most heartfelt improvisation we've heard in years. Samuel, who had spent a decade fading into the background, was suddenly a name people knew. The conservatory's board, initially hesitant, saw the opportunity. They appointed Samuel as an adjunct faculty member for jazz improvisation, a role that came with a small office and a modest salary, more than he'd ever earned as a janitor. The same students who once passed him without a glance now gathered around the piano, hanging on his every word. He taught them not just technique, but feeling, urging them to find the stories in their music, to play not for applause but for truth. Savannah, too, sought him out. She asked him to mentor her, not as the untouchable prodigy, but as a student hungry to learn. Together, they crafted a duet for the next showcase, a piece that blended her classical precision with his soulful improvisation. It was unlike anything the conservatory had ever heard, a conversation between two worlds that left the audience in tears. For Samuel, the fame was secondary. He didn't need the spotlight or the viral videos. All he'd ever wanted was for someone to listen, and now they did. Not just to his music, but to the man behind it. He thought of his daughter, now grown and living across the country, and how he'd call her tonight to tell her everything. He thought of his wife, who had always believed in his music and felt her presence in every note he played. And he thought of Savannah, who had seen something in him when no one else had and chose to amplify his voice. The conservatory was no longer just a place of polished perfection. It was a place where stories were told, where souls were bared, where a janitor could sit at a piano and remind the world that music and kindness could change everything.